The first consul remained some days in this capital. I had time to cement a more intimate acquaintance with my colleagues. They were, as I have said, Messieurs Ambar, Rustam, and Hebert. We relieved each other every 24 hours at noon precisely. My first care, as it all had always been when I have had to live with new faces, was to observe as closely as I could the character and temper of my comrades, so as to draw conclusions from them which would afterwards regulate my conduct where they were concerned, and to know in advance pretty much what I might have to hope for or to fear from their acquaintance. Ambar had an unlimited devotion to the first consul, whom he had followed to Egypt. But he unfortunately had a somber and misanthropic character, which made him extremely cross and disagreeable. The favor enjoyed by Rustam had probably contributed not a little towards augmenting this gloomy disposition. In his species of mania, he imagined himself the object of an altogether special surveillance. As soon as his service was ended, he would shut himself up in his room and pass his entire leisure in the most doleful solitude. When the first consul was in good humor, he would joke him about his unsociability and laughingly call him Mademoiselle Ambar. Well, mademoiselle, what are you doing all alone this way in your room? You are reading some bad novels there, no doubt, some worthless old books treating of princesses abducted and held in surveillance by a barbarous giant. To this poor Ambar would reply with a churlish air, General, you doubtless know better than I do what I am doing, intending by these words an allusion to the espionage by which he believed himself surrounded. In spite of this unhappy disposition, the first consul was very good to him. At the time of the journey to the camp of Bologna, he refused to follow the emperor, who retired him from the post of porter to the palace of Meudon. Here he committed 1,000 follies. His end was lamentable. During the 100 days after an audience with the emperor, he was seized with one of his spells and threw himself with such force on a kitchen knife that the blade protruded 2 inches through his back. It was thought in those days that I had the emperor's wrath to dread. The rumor spread that it was I who had committed suicide, and this tragic death was announced as mine in several journals. Hebert, valet de chambre ordinaire, was a very gentle young man, but excessively timid. Like all the rest of the household, he had the most devoted affection for the first consul. It happened one day in Egypt that the latter, who had never been able to shave himself, it was I, as I shall relate hereafter with some details, that taught him how to do so, called for Hebert in the absence of Ambar, who usually shaved him to perform that duty, as it has sometimes happened to Hebert as a result of his great timidity, to cut his master's chin. The latter, who had a pair of scissors in his hand, said to Hebert as he approached holding his razor, Take good care, you rogue. If you cut me, I will poke my scissors into your belly. This threat, made with an air that was almost serious, but which was really nothing but a joke, such as I have repeatedly noticed the emperor loved to make, produced such an impression on Hebert that he was unable to finish his work. He was seized with a convulsive trembling. His razor fell from his hands, and it was useless for the commander-in-chief to stretch out his neck and repeat with a laugh, Come, finish then, you coward! Hebert was not only obliged to stop there, but from that time forward he was obliged to relinquish the office of barber. The emperor disliked this excessive timidity in those who served him, but that did not prevent him, when he had the chateau of Rambouillet renovated, from giving the place of porter there to Hebert, who had asked for it. Rustam, so well known under the name of the Emperor's Mameluke, belonged to a good Georgian family, carried off at the age of 6 or 7 years and taken to Cairo. He had been brought up among the young slaves who served the Mamelukes, while awaiting the time when they shall be old enough to enter that warlike militia themselves. The Sheik of Cairo, when giving General Bonaparte a magnificent Arabian steed, had also given him Rustam, and Ibrahim, another Mameluke, who was afterwards attached to Madame Bonaparte's service under the name of Ali. It is known that Rustam became an indispensable accompaniment on every occasion when the emperor appeared in public. He was a part of every journey, every cortege, and, what was most honorable of all, of every battle. In the brilliant staff which followed the emperor, he shone above all the rest by the glitter of his rich oriental costume. The sight of him produced a prodigious effect, especially on the common people, and in the provinces he was supposed to be in high credit with the emperor, and this arose, according to certain credulous persons, from the fact that Rustam had saved his master's life by throwing himself between him and the saber of an enemy about to strike him. I believe that this was an error. The altogether special favor of which he was the object was sufficiently accounted for by the habitual kindness of his majesty for all those who were in his service. Moreover, his favor did not extend beyond the circle of the domestic relations. Monsieur Rustam married a young and pretty French woman named Mademoiselle de Ville, whose father was the Empress Josephine's valet de chambre. When in 1814 and 1815 some journals reproached him somewhat because he had not followed to the end the fortunes of him to whom he had always professed the greatest devotion, he replied that the family ties he had contracted forbade his leaving France, and that he could do nothing to disturb the happiness he enjoyed in his domestic life. Ibrahim took the name of Ali on passing into Madame Bonaparte's service. He was of a more than Arabian ugliness, and had a wicked glance. I recall a little circumstance concerning him which happened at Malmaison, and may give a notion of his character. One day when we were playing on the lawn of the chateau, I unintentionally caused him to fall while running. Furious at his stumble, he picked himself up, drew his poniard, which he never laid aside, and sprang towards me to strike me with it. I had laughed at first, like everyone else, at this accident, and amused myself by making him run. But warned by the cries of my comrades, and turning round to see how near he was, I perceived at once both his weapon and his anger. I stopped instantly, my foot firm and my eye fixed on his poniard, and I was lucky enough to avoid the thrust, although it just brushed against my breast. Furious in my own turn, as may be readily believed, I seized him by his wide trousers and threw him 10 feet away from me into the Malmaison River, which was barely 2 feet deep. The plunge quieted his senses in the first place, and besides, his poniard had sunk to the bottom of the water, which rendered my man much less redoubtable. But he began to scream so loudly in his disappointment that Madame Bonaparte heard him, and as she overflowed with kindness for her Mameluke, I was roundly scolded. Nevertheless, this poor Ali had such an unsociable temper that he quarreled with everybody in the house, and was finally sent to Fontainebleau as a chateau messenger. I returned to our campaign. June 13th, the first consul slept at Tura di Galifalo, where he had established his headquarters. The march of the army had not slackened since the day we entered Milan. General Murat had crossed the Po and seized Plaisance. General Lannes, although pushing ahead with his brave vanguard, had delivered a bloody battle at Montebello, the name he was afterwards to render illustrious by bearing it. The very recent arrival of Desaix, who came from Egypt, overwhelmed the commander-in-chief with joy, and also gave additional confidence to the soldiers, by whom the brave and modest Desaix was adored. The first consul had received him with the most frank and cordial friendship, and they immediately spent 3 consecutive hours alone together. At the close of this conference, an order of the day announced to the army that General Desaix would take command of the Boudet division. I heard several persons belonging to the suite of General Desaix remark that his patience and evenness of temper had been put to rude tests during his voyage by adverse winds, forced delays, the tediousness of quarantine, and especially by the malicious proceedings of the English, who had for some time kept him prisoner on their fleet in sight of the coast of France, notwithstanding that he was the bearer of a passport signed in Egypt by the English authorities as a result of a capitulation reciprocally accepted. His resentment against them, therefore, was of the most ardent sort, and he said he keenly regretted that the enemies he would have to fight were not English. In spite of the simplicity of his tastes and habits, nobody was more athirst for glory than this brave general. All his wrath against the English sprang from the fear he had that he would not arrive in time to reap new laurels. He arrived but too soon to find a glorious death, but alas, one so premature. The celebrated Battle of Marengo was delivered June 14th. It began early and lasted all day. I remained at the quarters with all the general's household. We were in a manner within reach of the cannon of the battlefield, and contradictory reports were all the time arriving. One would represent the battle as entirely lost. The next would give us the victory. There was a moment when the increase in the number of our wounded and the redoublement of the Austrian firing would make us believe for an instant that we were beaten. Then all of a sudden someone would come and tell us that this apparent defeat was merely the result of a bold maneuver of the first consul, and that a charge made by General Desaix had assured the winning of the battle. But the victory cost France, and the heart of the first consul, dear Desaix, struck by a ball, had fallen dead on the instant, and the grief of his men having only exasperated their courage, they had routed the enemy at the point of the bayonet, the latter having been badly cut up already by a brilliant charge by General Kellerman. The first consul slept on the field of battle. In spite of the decisive victory just gained, he was full of sadness. And in the evening, before Humbert and me, he said several things which proved the profound affliction he experienced from the death of General Desaix. That France had just lost one of her best defenders, and he his best friend. That no one knew all the virtue there was in Desaix's heart, and what genius in his head. Thus he consoled himself for his grief by eulogizing to everybody the hero had just died on the field of honor. My brave Desaix, he said again, had always desired to die like this. Then he added, almost with tears in his eyes, but need death have been so quick to grant his prayer. There was not a soldier in our victorious army who did not share so justifiable an affliction. Rapp and Savary, the general's aide-de-camp, remained in the bitterest despair beside the body of their chief, whom, in spite of his youth, they called their father, more to express his inexhaustible kindness towards them than on account of the gravity of his character. As a consequence of his respect for his friend's memory, the commander-in-chief, although his staff was complete, attached these young officers to himself as aides-de-camp. Commander Rapp, that was his rank then, was at this time what he has been all his life, good, full of courage, and universally beloved. His frankness, though sometimes a little rude, was pleasing to the emperor. I have heard the latter eulogize his aide-de-camp 1,000 times. He always called him my brave Rapp. This worthy general was not lucky in battles, and seldom took place in an affair without receiving some wound. Since I am already anticipating the course of events, I will say here that in Russia, on the eve of the Battle of Moscow, I heard the emperor say to General Rapp, who had arrived from Danzig, "Attention, my hero, we are going to fight tomorrow. Look out for yourself. Fortune does not spoil you." "That is one of the prerequisites of the trade," replied the general. "Rely on it, sire. I will not do less than my best." Monsieur Savary maintained towards the first consul that ardent zeal and boundless devotion which had attached him to General Desaix. If he lacked any one of General Rapp's qualities, it was certainly not that of bravery. Of all the men who surrounded the emperor, not one was more absolutely devoted to his slightest will. I shall doubtless have occasion during the course of these memoirs to recall some traits of this unexampled devotion for which the Duc de Rovigo was so magnificently rewarded, but it is just to say that he at least did not wound the hand that had elevated him, and that he gave to the very end, and after the end, of his former master. It is thus that it pleased him to style the emperor the not very well followed example of gratitude. A decree of the government in the following June provided that the body of Desaix should be transported to the convent of the Great Saint Bernard, and a monument for him raised there in attestation of the regrets of France, and especially of those of the first consul, in a spot where he had covered himself with immortal glory. Chapter 5. This victory of Marengo had assured the conquest of Italy, hence the first consul, judging his presence more necessary in Paris than at the head of his army, gave the chief command to General Massena, and made ready to recross the mountains. We returned to Milan, where the first consul was received with still more enthusiasm than during our first visit. The establishment of a republic crowned the wishes of the majority of the Milanese, and they styled the first consul their savior for having delivered them from the Austrian yoke. Nevertheless, there was a party which detested equally the changes, the French army which had been the instrument of them, and the young chief who was their author. In this party figured a celebrated artist, Marchesi, the singer. When we first went through, the first consul had sent for him, and the musician had begged to be excused from inconveniencing himself. He finally came, but with all the importance of a man who felt his dignity wounded. The very simple costume of the first consul, his short figure, and his pale and not very good-looking visage were not calculated greatly to impress the heroes of the theater. Hence, the commander-in-chief, having received him well and very politely, asked him to sing an air. He had responded by this bad pun, delivered in an impertinent tone which his Italian accent heightened. "Signor General, if it is a good air you want, you will find an excellent one by taking a little turn in the garden." For this pretty performance, Signor Marchesi was instantly turned out of doors, and that very evening an order had been sent to put him into prison. On his return, when the cannonading of Marengo had doubtless silenced his resentment against Marchesi, and when he thought moreover that the artist's penance for a wretched quibble had been long enough, the first consul sent for him and again begged him to sing. This time Marchesi was polite and modest and sang in an enchanting manner. After the concert, the first consul applauded him, shook his hand warmly, and complimented him in the most affectionate tone. From that moment, peace was concluded between the two powers, and Marchesi did nothing but chant the praises of the first consul thereafter. At this same concert, the first consul was struck by the beauty of a famous songstress, Madame Grassini. He did not find her cruel, and at the end of a few hours, the conqueror of Italy counted an additional conquest. She breakfasted next morning with the first consul and General Berthier in the chamber of the former. General Berthier was commissioned to provide for the journey of Madame Grassini, who was sent to Paris and attached to the concerts of the court. The first consul left Milan June 24th, and we re-entered France by way of Mont-Cenis. We traveled with the greatest rapidity. The first consul was received everywhere with an enthusiasm difficult to describe. Triumphal arches had been erected at the entrance of every town, and in each canton a deputation of notables came to harangue and compliment him. Long files of young girls dressed in white and crowned with flowers in their hands, and throwing flowers into the first consul's carriage were his only escorts, surrounding, following, and preceding him until he had passed, or whenever he alighted, until he set foot to the ground. Hence, this journey was throughout a perpetual festival. At Lyon, it was delirium. The whole city came out to meet him. He entered it in the midst of an immense crowd and the noisiest acclamations, and alighted at the Hotel de Célestin. During the Terror, and when the Jacobins had wreaked their whole fury on the city of Lyon, which they had sworn to ruin, the fine edifices which ornamented the Place Bellecour had been raised from top to bottom, and the hideous cripple Couthon had been the first to carry the sledgehammer thither at the head of the vilest rabble of the clubs. The First Consul detested the Jacobins, who on their side hated and feared him, and it was his most unceasing care to destroy their work, or better, to raise up again the ruins with which they had covered France. He thought then, and rightly, that he could not better respond to the affection of the Lyonnese than by encouraging with all his might the reconstruction of the buildings on the Place Bellecour, and he laid the first stone himself before his departure. The city of Dijon gave the First Consul a reception not less brilliant. Between Villeneuve and Sens, at the descent of the bridge of Montereau, the 8 horses plunged forward at a gallop, dragging the carriage very swiftly. The First Consul already traveled in royal style, and the screw of one of the front wheels came out. The people living along the road, witnessing this accident and foreseeing what would be the result of it, shouted with all their might to the postilions to stop, but the latter could not manage it. The carriage was rudely overturned. The First Consul received no damage. General Berthier's face was somewhat scratched by the broken glass of the windows. 2 footmen who were on the seat were thrown violently to a distance and rather badly bruised. The First Consul came out, or rather was hauled out through one of the doors. However, this accident did not stop him. He got at once into another carriage and reached Paris without any further mishap. He alighted at the Tuileries in the night of July 2nd. And when the news of his return had gone the rounds of Paris the next day, the entire population thronged the courts and garden. They crowded beneath the windows of the pavilion of Flora, hoping to get a glimpse of the savior of France, the liberator of Italy. In the evening, there was neither rich nor poor who did not illuminate his mansion or his garret. It was shortly after his arrival in Paris that the First Consul learned of the death of General Kleber. Suleiman's poniard had immolated this great captain the same day that the cannon of Marengo brought low another hero of the army of Egypt. This assassination afflicted the First Consul very keenly. I witnessed this, and I can affirm it. And yet his calumniators have dared to say that he was rejoiced at an event which, even to consider it merely on its political side, caused him the loss of a conquest, which had cost him so many efforts and France so much expense and blood. Other wretches, still more infamous and stupid, have gone so far as to imagine and to circulate the rumor that the First Consul had commanded the assassination of his companion in arms, of him whom he had put in his own place at the head of the army of Egypt. I know of but one answer to make to such people, if my answer is needed. It is that they never knew the emperor. After his return, the First Consul often went with his wife to Malmaison, where he sometimes remained for several days. At this period, the valet on duty followed the carriage on horseback. One day, as he was going to Paris, the First Consul perceived, when about 100 paces from the chateau, that he had forgotten his snuff-box. He told me to go and find it. I wheeled and set off at a gallop, and having found the snuff-box on the First Consul's bureau, I set off at the same pace on this track. I did not come up with his carriage until we reached Rueil. But just as I was about to do so, my horse's foot slipped on a pebble. He fell and threw me over into a ditch. The fall was severe. I remained stretched out on the spot, a shoulder dislocated and an arm badly bruised. The First Consul had his horses stopped at once, gave himself the orders necessary for taking me up, and indicated the attentions which must be given me in my condition. I was carried in his presence to the Rueil barracks, and before continuing his route, he assured himself that I was in no danger. The family doctor was summoned to Rueil, where he set my shoulder and dressed my arm. From there I was taken as gently as possible to Malmaison. The excellent Madame Bonaparte was so kind as to visit me, and had all possible attentions lavished on me. On the day when I resumed my service after my recovery, I was in the First Consul's antechamber. Just as he was leaving his cabinet, he came up to me and asked with much interest how I was. I answered him that, thanks to the care of my excellent masters, had cause to be given me, I was completely cured. So much the better, said the First Consul to me. Constant, make haste to regain your former strength. Continue to serve me well, and I will take care of you. Here, added he, putting 3 little papers in my hand, This is to replenish your wardrobe. And he passed on without listening to the thanks I was addressing to him with much emotion, far more for the benevolence and the interest he had deigned to display than for his present, for I did not know in what that consisted. When he was gone, I enrolled my chiffons. They were 3 banknotes of 1,000 francs each. I was affected to tears by so perfect a kindness. It must be remembered that at this time the First Consul was not rich, although he was the first magistrate of the Republic. Hence the recollection of this generous deed still moves me profoundly even now. I do not know whether anyone will be interested by details so personal to me, but I think them calculated to make known the character of the Emperor, so outrageously misapprehended, and his habitual manner with the people of his household. They will at the same time afford grounds for a conclusion as to whether the rigid economy he required in his family, and of which I shall myself have occasion to speak elsewhere, was, as it has been called, a sordid avarice, or not rather a rule of prudence, which he willingly departed from when urged to do so by his kindness or his humanity. I do not know whether my memory deceives me in making me set down here a circumstance that proves the esteem the First Consul had for the heroes of his army, and which he liked to display to them on every occasion. I was in his bedroom one day at the usual hour for his toilette, and was on that day fulfilling the duties of the first valet de chambre, Humbert. Being either absent or in some way hindered, there was no one in the apartment, apart from the attendants, except the brave and modest Colonel Gerard Lacoue, one of the First Consul's aides-de-camp. Monsieur Jerome Bonaparte, then hardly 17 years old, was introduced. This young man was giving his family frequent subjects for complaint, and feared nobody but his brother Napoleon, who reprimanded, preached to, and scolded him as if he had been his son. There was a question at the time of making him a sailor, less for the sake of a career than to remove him from the seductive temptations which the lofty fortune of his brother caused to spring up under his feet, and which he was very far from resisting. One can understand that it cost him something to relinquish pleasures so easy and so intoxicating to a young man. Hence he never failed to proclaim his inaptitude for the naval service on every occasion, going so far, it was said, as to allow himself to be rejected by the marine examiners, although with a little study and goodwill it would have been easy for him to answer their questions. However, the will of the First Consul had to be obeyed, and Monsieur Jerome was obliged to embark on the day I am speaking of, after some minutes of conversation and of grumbling, always on the subject of the marine. Monsieur Jerome said to his brother, "Instead of sending me to die of ennui at sea, you ought to take me for aide-de-camp." "You greenhorn!" his brother responded briskly. "Wait until a ball shall have plowed up your face, and then we will see." And at the same time he glanced towards Colonel Lacoue, who reddened and cast down his eyes like a young girl. To understand how flattering to him this answer was, one should know that his face was scarred by a ball. This brave colonel was killed in 1805 before Günzburg. The emperor keenly regretted him. He was one of the most intrepid and most learned men in the army. It was, I think, about this epoch that the First Consul was smitten with a strong passion for a young lady full of wit and grace, Madame D. Madame Bonaparte, suspecting this intrigue, showed that she was jealous of it, and her husband did all he could to allay the conjugal suspicions. He waited until everybody was asleep before going to his mistress, and even carried precautions so far as to make the transit between the two apartments in night drawers, minus either shoes or stockings. I once saw the day break before he returned, and dreading scandal, I went according to the orders given me by the First Consul himself, in case such a thing should happen, to warn Madame D. waiting woman, so that on her part she could go and tell her mistress the hour. Hardly 5 minutes after this prudent warning had been given, I saw the first consul returning in considerable agitation, of which I presently learned the cause. He had caught sight, as he was coming back, of one of Madame Bonaparte's women, who was spying on him through the window of a cabinet opening on the corridor. The first consul, after a vigorous outburst against the curiosity of the fair sex, sent me to the young scout of the enemy's camp to notify her of the order to hold her tongue if she did not want to be dismissed, and not to repeat her indiscretion in the future. I do not know whether he did not add some gentler argument to these terrible threats in order to buy her silence, but whether through fear or favor she had the good sense to keep quiet. Nevertheless, the successful lover, fearing some new surprise, ordered me to hire a little house in the Allée des Veuves, where he and Madame D met from time to time. This is the way in which the first consul always acted towards his wife. He was full of consideration for her and took every imaginable means of preventing his infidelities from reaching her knowledge. Moreover, these passing infidelities attracted nothing from his tenderness for her, and although other women may have inspired him with love, none had his confidence and friendship to the same extent as Madame Bonaparte. It is the same with the emperor's severity and brutality towards women as it is with the 1,001 other calumnies of which he was the object. He was not always courtly, but no one ever saw him coarse. And however singular this observation may appear, after what I have just narrated, he professed the greatest veneration for a well-conducted woman, praised faithful marriages, and did not like indecency, either in morals or language. Although he had several secret liaisons, it was not his fault that they were not carefully concealed.